Thank you so much for inviting me to your conference all the way from Norway, and hello, Australia. I hope you can hear me. Good?
Yeah, perfect. Yep,
Yeah,
very good.
yeah, great. And thank you very much for the two presenters before me. Really interesting to listening in. And I must also comment that you have come so much further in your work with research and indigenous people than we have in Norway. But what I hope I can provide is with some insights on human remains research. So the plan is to focus the talk on human remains research and indigenous people, but I must also give you some background info about our system here. Yes, I hope you can see my presentation now.
Yes, we can. Thank you, Lene.
Yes, great. So we are in Norway, which is a country on the Scandinavian peninsula in the northern Europe. It's a small country with a population of 5.5 million people. So it's a bit different than in Australia. And the National Research Ethics Committees, that's where I work. And as the name says, it's committees that deals with research ethics on a national level. We have 5 committees covering all research fields and subject areas. We have 1 committee for science and technology, 1 for medicine and health, 1 for social sciences and the humanities, 1 for investigation of research misconduct, and 1 for human remains. And we have a secretariat, that's where I work. The committee members are appointed by the Norwegian Ministry of Education and Research, and they sit for a maximum of 8 years. The members, they are mainly researchers and other experts from different disciplines and institutions, but there are also lay members in the committees. The committees, they represent the research community. They are independent and they cannot be instructed by any authority. So, the National Committee's main task is to ensure that research takes place in accordance with recognized research ethics norms. The committees, they're primarily advisory bodies and do not pre-approve research. Yes, and by the way, we are operating with a broad definition of research ethics, covering the whole spectrum from good scientific practice to the relationship with society and socio-ethical responsibilities. And on a side note, we also in Norway have a separate body for pre-approval of research, and then it's only for medical and health research involving humans, human biological material or health information. That is the regional committees for medical and health research ethics, the HRECs. But back to the national committees. A main focus for the national committees are to develop guidelines for research ethics. The guidelines from the committees, they are not legislative. They are based on recognized norms and standards within the research community. They are advisory, and their purpose is to invite reflection on an assessment of ethical issues. Some norms and practices are alike across disciplines, but others are not. And the committee's experience is that there is a need for field and area-specific guidance on research ethics in order to cope with issues that are particular to each field. So that is why we develop field-specific guidelines. And on that note, I will move over to a particular field of research, which is human remains research. And in this context, human remains are not human material kept in biobanks, but skeletal materials and other human remains, mainly kept in museums and collections or discovered in archaeological and other excavations. So human remains encompass several identities. They are the remains of individuals deserving of respectful treatment. They represent groups whose history and culture are likewise deserving of respectful treatment. And at the same time, they are a scientific resource for improving our understanding of past societies and its people. In Norway, in the national committee system, we have a committee specializing on ethical dilemmas on the field of human remains research. This committee was established as a response to questions on research on the return of indigenous human remains. The committee is advisory, and its main task is to promote ethically responsible research on human remains. It provides advice to researchers, research institutions, and authorities, and sets out research ethics guidelines. So these are our guidelines on the field. They are not based on law, but on recognized norms and standards within the research community. They are advisory and encourage reflection on and assessment of ethical issues. So these guidelines were first published in 2013, and they were last revised in 2022. They include 11 articles split into two parts. Part A, recognition, consideration, and context, and Part B, analysis, results, dissemination, and repatriation or return. Part A focuses on considerations of individuals, descendants, groups, discovery context, origin, and ownership history. Part B focuses on considerations of research quality, the use of destructive methods, data management, repatriation or return, and visual dissemination. And most of the work that the Human Remains Committee does is based on these guidelines. The committee deals with a variety of topics: skeletal analysis, ancient DNA research, exhibitions in museums, and handling of human remains in collections, and also questions on the return or repatriation of human remains of indigenous or minority groups. And in the further, I will give you a brief introduction to two cases the committee has handled. The first case, it's called the Pasvik case, involves the Sami. And the Sami people is an indigenous population in Norway, but also in Sweden, Finland, and the Kola Peninsula in Russia. Norway, along with these other nations, long had an official policy of forced assimilation of the Sami and national minorities, and of suppressing their culture and languages, with all the consequences that has had. The Pasvik case is a case from the 1950s when a Sami cemetery on an islet in the river Pasvik in the far north in Norway were excavated. It was excavated due to a danger of being destroyed of the river, and the local Sami population reportedly agreed to the excavation on the condition that the skeletons be reburied after the examination. And most of the skeletons were reburied, but 20 skulls and some bones from 16 skeletons were taken to the University of Oslo. The dating of the skeletons range between 1310 and 1920 AD. In 2013, the University of Oslo received a claim for return and reburial from an Orthodox congregation that claimed to represent the individuals from the cemetery. And the University of Oslo sent a request for advice to the Human Remains Committee. Some key points from the committee's advice are that it should be the Sami Parliament, which is an official representative of the affected groups, that has the right and responsibility to make the final decision in the case. should be established a working group that is responsible for implementing an open and inclusive process where all voices involved are heard and relevant arguments are taken seriously. Involve the local community and the affected people and groups, and consider also the provenance and the context for excavation and the research potential. And currently, the case is being processed by the Sami Parliament pending a decision. The second case that I wanted to shortly present to you is involves remains from Rapa Nui, Easter Island. In the 1950s, the Norwegian adventurer Thor Heyerdahl brought human remains back from Rapa Nui to Norway under questionable circumstances. These remains have since been kept at a museum in Oslo and at the University of Oslo. And between 2013 and 2018, a research group from the University of Oslo, they wanted to do research on these remains and sample the skulls for ancient DNA. The research group made several requests for ethical advice from the Human Remains Committee. And the Human Remains Committee strongly advised against the sampling on the grounds that sampling is invasive and destructive. And the ownership was unclear, and there was a lack of involvement and permission from representatives on the island. The committee advised the research group to identify and consult relevant representatives in the local communities before any sampling. But in 2019, the magazine Research Ethics wrote an article about the Rapa Nui case, revealing that the research group had actually sampled the skulls without regarding the committee's advice. I won't have the time to go into that, but you can read more about that in the magazine article, which is in English. And recently, 12th November this year, the human remains were returned to Rapa Nui. So these two cases, they concern both human remains and indigenous peoples. Some of the concerns, they are particular to human remains research. However, many of the concerns are particular to research and indigenous peoples. And there are many questions here, and I know that you're much more familiar with these questions than we are in Norway. These are some examples of issues and questions, and I think I will just move on to the next slide because I think I might be running out of time. And my key point here is that, as I mentioned in the introduction, in Norway, we have several sets of field-specific research ethics guidelines. We have for social sciences and humanities, for science and technology, for human remains, and also the Sami Parliament in Norway has developed ethical guidelines for Sami health research. However, we do not have a set of guidelines for research ethics and indigenous peoples. When dealing with cases, we have to look to different sets of guidelines. And some of the guidelines that we have looked to is the guidelines from Australia, because you have sets of guidelines, and we are really curious in Norway about how they work. And we are also pondering whether there is a need for particular guidelines covering all research involving indigenous peoples in Norway, or maybe even the Nordic countries, because we have the same indigenous group of people. Yes, so on that note, I would like to thank you very much for the attention, and if there's time, I'll open to questions, but I don't know if there's any time left. Thank you very much.
Excuse me. Hi, Lena. Thank you so much for that. I'm just going to get my video on. Keeps going off. So maybe just a couple of questions. Firstly, In those cases you mentioned, Rapa Nui and the Sami people, were your guidelines sufficient for the purpose, or have you had to amend the guidelines as a result of these instances, which probably occur from time to time?
Yeah, no, the guidelines have not been sufficient. So we have had to look at other guidelines and conventions and resolutions. And we have also had to revise the guidelines based on experience with cases.
I mean that's as it should be. I guess you go on you develop and you evolve. I was just curious though, in relation to that, and maybe the second question, in terms of your consultation. So when you come across instances with the Sami remains, but you've developed guidelines, did your consultation take into account Sami people in the first place, or have you recognized that as a result of what's likely to occur, and bearing in mind your background's archaeology, so you're going to know all this stuff, do you does a consultation always and automatically involve Sami indigenous people, or how does it work?
Well, we don't go out and consult because we get the requests to us first. So we have to wait until the requests come, but we are out there on dialogue meetings with the Sami representatives and with the Sami parliament. And also in the committee, I forgot to say this probably, but we also have a representative from the Sami community in the committee. But we wait until the requests come. We don't go out there and find the cases, if that was what you meant.
Well, I'm just curious, because you can't really sort of develop guidelines unless you have the right input. And I wonder,
well, all right, yeah. Sorry, yeah, when we develop guidelines, we always send them out to on hearings. So we get inputs from all the relevant actors out there, from the Sami parliament, from different Sami groups, from museums, from universities. Yes, we get
yeah,
inputs
nice.
and then we develop the guidelines based on that. Yeah.
And I noticed, you say you have those 5 main ethics committees, although I suspect all the universities probably have their own sort of committees. But what is the Sami representation on ethics committees? Do you know?
Well, actually, there aren't any Sami representatives in any research ethics committees. It's only in the Human Remains Committee, actually.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So as I said, you've come much further on this work than we have in Norway. So we have so much to learn.
Well, that's well, I'm glad we're ahead on
But
some things. So very good.
But I must say one thing is that it's the Sami parliament in Norway, which is the official representative for the Sami population. They are the ones who decide in cases involving Sami people in research. So yeah.
Yes, and as Gary points out there, the Sami do have a parliament, and I think you pointed
Yes.
that out yourself. Now, Lena, we're going to have to leave it there because time is getting on. Luckily, you're up in time for your day and in plenty of time.